So James not only volunteered me, he set to me the hardest task possible, which is, hey, you are so engaged in this subject that you started a company about it. Now please give a talk about it that is not a pitch. Which was actually a great challenge, right? It's really refreshing. I've been working on the company since last May, but many of the ideas have been gestating for 20 years, right? And so it's a really refreshing challenge from James to take a step back and look at it from a bigger picture, not just the nuts and bolts of the company we're building, but the bigger question of how did open source get to where it is today, where it is simultaneously massively successful, and also, as James just ably laid out, sort of a wreck, right? And so I want to start first by talking about what the standard story of free and open source software is, right? It's about sharing. As an old professor of mine used to say, if you wrap the entire world in internet and spin it, software comes out. And that's a really great story, right? And it's a true story. It's made my professional career a very fun one, because like many of you, through that sharing, through that essential communication that is at the core of open source, I've made a network of friends around the world, I've built an entire career, maybe even a little useful software resulted. So I think that story of sharing is one we tell a lot. And today I want to tell a story about open source that is slightly different and slightly less told. And that's the story of friction in open source. So what do I mean by friction? In our context, by friction, I mean the rough edges of our systems, right? The little things that make our big picture systems run slightly less efficiently, make them slightly more painful to use, but maybe also make them a little more fun. This friction is all over. We saw it this morning in old Porsches that require more work than modern cars. We saw it in old printing presses that we literally deliberately decrease the efficiency of them to make them more interesting. And of course, we see it in software. So, whoops. Nope. I mean, so as I was saying, software has a lot of friction. Let me tell you about why I am an expert in friction. This is how I normally dress to really go to war. I am a professional source of friction. I was a software QA guy, and then I went to law school. And so people see me coming from a mile away, and they say, not that guy, right? So I'm an expert. What I meant to say was I'm an expert in identifying and fixing friction. But certainly you can see why many people might think of it as a source of causing friction. Besides destroying things through QA and contracts, like I was saying, and James ably introduced, I recently co-founded a company called Tidelift. There will be exactly one slide of pitching, blink or fall asleep or go get a beer and you'll miss it. So how are we going to talk about friction? First, I want to talk about how free and open source software really got its start in part by erasing a bunch of friction and therefore creating a ton of value. Second, I want to talk about how there's still a lot of friction left, maybe in ways we don't always think about, and how that friction is probably getting worse as our systems get bigger and more complex. Then we'll take a little historical detour. We'll talk about the Luddites. We'll take a ride up to Nottingham, and we'll talk about what happens when removing friction removes people, and what happens when those people fight back. Hint, history usually written by the winners, and we'll see that here. Finally, we'll talk about some options going forward. What can we do to tweak our frictions to make for an open source that's more sustainable? First, let's talk about the beginning of the FOSS story, right? If we take a step back, put your thinking caps on, take a second, think to 1997, and if you're like me, you're probably thinking about enterprise software licensing. No? Okay. that was a painful state of being. If you wanted to start a company, you had to buy a Solaris server, you had to negotiate with Sun salespeople, and that was most of your capital already gone. The breakthrough technological innovation of FOSS was the no friction, no cost license. It took something that had been a high friction barrier, dealing with salespeople, coming up with a pile of money and negotiating with their lawyers, into something that just happened. You could literally just click, download that tarball, you had software, you went, right? We also had collaboration technologies. We had IRC, we had CVS, we had mailing lists. All of those things were way better than what proprietary software had at the time. Now, of course, we just have them as Slack and GitHub, and if you invest in the right things at the right time, you've got a unicorn on your hands. This lack of friction made FOSS a lubricant for the entire rest of the industry. It is not an exaggeration to say that FOSS has dominated the software world. You cannot write proper commercial software. Literally, before I started the company, I was doing a deal, an acquisition of a small company, and the CEO of that company said, "No, we have no open source." And that literally almost killed the deal, because the acquiring company was like, "Is this guy an idiot?" We're pretty sure, needless to say, about 90% of the way through the acquisition process is like, "Oh, yeah, right, yeah, we do." That was very profitable for me in my old hat as a private lawyer, but sort of a pain in the neck for these companies, right? You all know this story. The low-cost building blocks at the bottom of our stack have enabled a great deal of frictionless innovation at the top of the stack, money that used to get spent on Solaris and Qnix and a whole bunch of other things. No offense to our Adobe friends, including EAM. These things just aren't there anymore. Of course, the other part of this friction, when you lose friction, you sometimes fall on your ass. The money slips through your fingers, right? By relinquishing control as authors of FOSS, we also relinquished much of our ability to charge for it. Much of my legal career has been spent counseling companies who figure this out way too late. They gave away all their value, got some VC funding, come to me a couple years later and say, "Wait, how do we close the door?" And that horse is in a glorious field full of sunlight and poppies. The barn door, I'm sorry to say, cannot be closed. Again, profitable for me, pretty lousy for everybody else in the system. Of course, that friction is not entirely gone, right? We are in a much better place than we were 20 years ago. We're actually, this week, it's a little surprising it hasn't been mentioned yet, this is the 20th anniversary of the coining of the phrase open source, literally, I think, tomorrow, Saturday. And it's amazing to think of how far we've come. Yet there's still a lot of friction left. And in particular, I think there's three big sources of friction left within open source software that are particularly critical when we're talking about how we sustain open source software. The first one is simply that software is hard, right? And so all software is hard, but particularly frictionless software. FOSS is at its best when we have these small atomic units that we can use without thinking about, right? NPM, Docker, these are almost platonic ideals of using software without thinking about it. We download it, we grab it, and it just works, right? Except when it doesn't. We had LeftPad just sort of vanish off NPM and break half the world. OpenSSL, it turns out, I found out last week, hadn't really internalized it, literally a math teacher in Germany in his spare time on his weekends is a huge chunk of OpenSSL, right? James was talking about how we don't respect teachers. It turns out this poor guy has a double whammy of being both an underappreciated free software maintainer and an underappreciated teacher. Hey, I guess we're getting acquired. Maybe we should pay a lawyer to read some licenses. There are all these little sources of friction that are inherent in the nature of software, right? It's just hard to do some of these things. So then we make it even harder for ourselves, right? Because when many of us started back here, it was like, oh my God, I'm using 15 packages of open source. It's going to take me a long time to read all those licenses. Now it's 1,500 packages is like a good start, right? Because that's what, you just turn on NPM and it's like, yeah, 1,000 packages, seems nice. We'll just pick a few at random, go. Charity was talking about, by implication, how software monitoring at scale, big scale, is hard. And I'll suggest that everything we are doing here is harder for ourselves because what the scope of what we're doing keeps growing. This graph here, libraries.io, is a Tidelift project, something that we recently partnered with. It tracks 2 million open source packages over 30 package ecosystems. This number is just up and to the right. It's not getting smaller. It's not ever going to get smaller. So if we want to remain productive, we've got to reduce friction. Because at this scope, every single rough edge, particularly long-term support, API stability, as well as all these other things I've been talking about, can cause a lot of pain. I will say the trends in friction are not entirely bad. So in 2015, GitHub was saying that less than 20% of repositories in GitHub had licensing information. Now, this is not quite apples to oranges here, but in our recent data from library, it's not quite apples to apples. It is almost like apples to oranges. They're going to fire me for being a Californian for not knowing the difference between fruit and citrus. So we're now showing that something more like 20% of at least packages that are mature enough to be included in package management systems are unlicensed. So we've actually made some progress here. And there's a few reasons, right? People simply have pride in what they do. That's always been a driver of open source. People are learning more, right? GitHub in particular made a big effort to educate maintainers about the importance of licensing. There was also the invisible hand of the market, right? If every company that cares about licensing submits just a few packages, it submits just a few patches to fix what's in GitHub, the graph goes up and to the right in a pretty healthy way. Of course, as we've been reminded by OpenSSL and by struts in Equifax and by a whole bunch of other things, when you get to problems that are more complex than licensing, where you can't just hire an idiot lawyer like myself, but you have to buy somebody who actually remembers how to code, it's not clear if the graph is up and to the right in the same way. It's also critically not clear who is doing that work. And that's going to bring us to the third source of friction in our systems, and that's people. We all have our rough edges. We all want to go have a beer, and that sometimes leads to problems. And so I want to talk in this third section of the talk about frictionless human beings. What happens when we try to take people with all their humanity and turn them into little cogs in the machines? And we're going to start by literally talking about turning them into cogs in machines by hopping on a train to Nottingham circa 1810, 1811. How many of you are familiar with the term Luddites? How many of you are familiar with the fact that the definition of Luddite was written by the winners, which is to say the folks who owned the factories? All right, okay, the British educational system better than the American one. So under their maybe mythical leader Ned Ludd, for those of you who don't know the story, the folks who, the stockingers, literally the people who made stockings in the Nottingham area, were getting replaced by stocking frames, devices, I'll show you a picture of one in a second, that were an early technology of the Industrial Revolution. And they said, boy, this really sucks. And they went around literally smashing these machines. They were also called breakers because they literally just broke the machines. And so because of that, we've been bequeathed this general usage of Luddite as somebody who hates the technology. And the reality that I want to tell about the Luddites, that apparently those of you in a proper schooling system already knew, is that what they were actually angry about was losing control of their lives, which happened to be happening to them because of technology. Let me explain to that a bit. Stockingers were skilled craftspeople. Just like a lot of us, they had it pretty good, actually, certainly relative to a lot of other folks in the English countryside around the turn of the 1800s. They had deep human relationships with their suppliers and buyers, and critically, they had a fair amount of flexibility in their lives. If they wanted to kick back and have a beer in the middle of the afternoon, they could do that. If they wanted to hang out with their kids in the middle of the afternoon, they could do that. If they wanted to work harder, they could also do that. They could just put in a few more hours. And this was, perhaps not surprisingly when you describe it that way, a lifestyle that many of them loved. And it was a lifestyle that they were angry about losing. So to put it another way, that friction, right, because the folks who bought the stockings, who took them from Nottingham to sell to the masses in London, were pretty unhappy if a stockinger showed up and said, sorry, I don't have quite as much as you expected because I decided to go have a beer this afternoon. To them, that looked like friction, right? That looked like inefficiency. But to the stockingers, that looked like, I've got a pretty good life. I had a beer this afternoon. And to them, it looked like self-control. This friction looked like autonomy and self-employment. And when those jobs turned into machines, turned into factories, suddenly they had time clocks, also invented not too long after this. They had machinery owned and controlled by their bosses instead of owned and controlled by themselves. To the boss's perspective, as I already said, these frictions are costs, right? And so the thing is, this is a two-edged story, right? These folks lost their livelihood, but everybody in London suddenly had much cheaper socks. And that's like actually not a bad thing, right? Even as late as the early 1900s, the average American had one work shirt that they wore all week and laundered on the weekends, right? Now, we all complain, oh my God, I don't have enough closet space, right? And that is in part because factory owners said, you know what? We should have some machines. So this is a story that is not all bad, but those benefits were far in the future, and the pain to that quality lifestyle was very real, very immediate, and so they protested. They usually didn't assault their bosses. Labor organizing was literally punishable by death, so they were about as likely to unionize as software developers. And they smashed the machines that were ruining their livelihood. So that's the core, I think, of the Luddite story for us. This was a system that wanted to reduce friction for reasons, again, not all that bad. We went from people who lived lives by their own rhythm and patterns and therefore weren't totally predictable, didn't run totally smoothly, didn't always do that security audit you wanted, and we turned them into people who are as close to cogs in the machine as we could possibly make them given the technology of the time. That story should sound familiar, right? We are pushing to make those graphs go up and to the right. And intuitively, fewer license problems, fewer security problems, take your pick of things that good maintenance can fix. When we look at them as graphs, when we look at them as fewer NPM errors, those all look like good things. But they may not always be great to those of us who are actually doing the work. So now what? To be clear, friction is not the only way to think about the sustainability problem. I'm really looking forward to how Pia talks about it later this afternoon. But it is a lens I've found helpful when I think about what comes next. Because how we solve the sustainability problem is going to be important because we ultimately need to preserve the low friction that made open source so valuable in the first place. If we stick a bunch of rules and fences around it that mean that when we do NPM, we suddenly have to talk to a lawyer 1,500 times, then we've probably failed. But what other options do we have? So, one option is what would Ned Ludd do, right? We, the neo-stockingers, the makers of the new artisanal socks, we like our abilities to play it fast and loose. We love our abilities to hop on a plane and come to London and have a beer and call it work. We love that we can release open source and do good in the world without ever talking to our bosses or without even having bosses in some case. I submit that we don't actually have that choice. Just as the Luddites became a historical footnote because the value of a frictionless industrial machine outweighed the benefits of an artisanal lifestyle, we are going to continue to grow and build our stacks. Our users are going to continue to demand software that is more complex. Our bosses are going to demand stuff that's more robust. And so we're going to need to continue to reduce friction in ways that's going to make open source seem less and less like fun and more just like our day jobs. So the other historical solution, of course, is, in fact, to turn people into cogs in a machine. And we all say, code is an art. we are crafting this fine Porsche out of lumps of things we found in a field, and we are artisans, and we're like putting together the lead type, and it's awesome. And of course, that is partially true, modulo that Google may like use some machine learning to suddenly replace us all tomorrow. But assuming that doesn't happen, there's a lot of stuff around open source that isn't art, right? So for example, GitHub said, hey, all of the users of GitHub software are complaining about only 20% of the software being licensed. So hey, you, the maintainer, this is your problem. Let me give you a dialogue to create additional work for you to solve the problems of all these enterprises. I saw an even better, so this is the open source license dialogue that you get when you create a new project in GitHub. I saw an even better one yesterday that makes it one click for you to file an issue against a project to say, hey, your licensing information is screwed up, you go do the work and fix it. Which is like this amazing, like we have reduced the friction for making other people's lives suck. And I submit to you that that is maybe also not a solution. Even if Ned Ludd's employers would have thought, thumbs up, right? So if we want to change course, some options when we think about how we reduce friction for users while not letting self-control slip through our fingers. So one option is patronage. This is Queen Elizabeth. Well, I don't need to explain this. You all had a proper education. This is Queen Elizabeth. She was a patron of Shakespeare. And we're seeing this have a resurgence in the software space right now. Patreon has had a lot of interesting wins. I was talking to someone just last week who quit their job because they like put up a request for Patreon to their mailing list and suddenly had enough money that they could pay their rent. Open Collective is amazing, and Pia is going to talk about that later. I'm ex-Mozilla and I'm ex-Wikipedia. I've worked at both of those places and still consider myself a part of both of those communities. So I love the idea of people giving to support without strings attached. However, I'm concerned that this is not going to scale, right? If the patronage recipient can point to specific frictions. Is Chris from Linux Foundation still in the audience here? Hi, Chris. Linux Foundation has found this wonderful sweet spot where they tell their patrons, we are going to reduce the friction of governance. And their patrons are eating that up, right? They found this specific sticky wicket that everybody got stuck in. Did I use that right? Good, good. Now that I've got some Brits on my team, I have like a translation team, but they were drinking again. When you can reduce friction, patronage may be a good example. But again, we're not talking about the day when there were 2,500 packages. We're talking about the day when there are 2.5 million. And it's unclear the patronage will scale. So what about bounties? This is an oldie but goodie, payments to fix specific problems or add specific features. It's a perennial solution to the open source sustainability problem. I have concerns, again. These tend not to scale well. There are lots of hidden costs. One of the startups that used to do this told me that they spent 40% of their revenue, not their profits, but their revenue, just verifying that the bounties actually were correctly completed. It doesn't impact small frictions that impact us at scale. Again, 15 license problems is your problem, 1,500 license problems is my problem. It's not clear that people are going to pay enough in a bounty model to make license stuff work. I think it will definitely continue to work in some spaces. Again, Linux Foundation is doing some interesting stuff with security in this way. So what about deliberate frictions? This here, new picture, just added this morning because it is a letterpressed open source license. A rare example in the field, one of 15. So when many of you think friction, you think all caps text. I lowercased this disclaimer of warranty. Thank you very much. This is a dimension of experimentation we're going to see is deliberate reintroduction of financial friction. You can think, those of you who are familiar with the Affero GPL, it's a license that says, hey, if you're using this in a web service, you still got to share. There's a new one called License Zero, which has some similar but interesting properties for proprietary use. That's a source of experimentation. We're also going to see tokens, right? Where Gitcoin, there's a bunch of other things. These are, when you're looking at it through the friction lens, they are the deliberate reintroduction of a slight amount of pain for the user in exchange for granting some power back to the maintainers who created the software. This is a super tough balancing act. I suspect we're going to see a lot of experimentation, probably a high rate of failure, but probably some successes too. You can think of Linus's use of the GPL as opposed to the already existing OpenBSD kernels or BSD family of kernels as an experiment in raising stickiness. Right, the GPL introduced new frictions, but it also meant that more people were engaged, including, as turned out to be a game changer, IBM. So some of these experiments in tweaking these frictions will work. Enterprise support. This is the longest serving sustainability model in FOSS. It reduces friction for enterprises by rounding off the rough edges, while reducing friction for developers by, hey, paying them. Traditionally, though, this hasn't scaled. The number of developers who actually get employed to do it, the Red Hat model is awesome if you're a Red Hat employer, if you're a Red Hat employee, or if you're a Google employee, but the amount of software covered has been spotty. In theory, Red Hat has supported OpenSSL for a long time. In practice, it turned out maybe not as well as we thought. And that's not a knock on Red Hat, right? What they're trying to do is damn hard, and they do it better than anybody. But yet, again, 1 out of every 1,000 packages in open source is covered by Red Hat. I promised exactly 1 slide worth of product pitch, and here it is. At Tidelift, we want to make it easy, low friction for developers to get paid for doing basic maintenance of the products that they love. Their projects, not somebody else's, their choices. And we want to make it easy and valuable for companies to pay them for that maintenance. And we want to do this at a big, ambitious scale so that as open source grows, we grow with it. Just as Etsy supports a large group of artisans, we want to support that vision of open source as craft. If that sounds interesting, me, my coworkers Ben and Jeremy will also be around to chat. I'll also post a quick survey URL at the end. We're asking for just a few minutes for people to help inform our attempt. Besides, Tidelift sounds fascinating. Please tell me more. I think there's 3 key takeaways from this talk. First, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We are right now in a time where a lot of people are unhappy with sustainability for a lot of very good reasons. If we throw out the low friction that made open source so powerful in the first place, we're going to do a lot of damage. Secondly, all too often in open source, we remove friction for ourselves. We say, hey, I'll make that a one-click button to make it somebody else's problem, right? When you are struck by that temptation, please think twice. Let's put developers at the center and not do that again. Finally, experiment, experiment, experiment. Like I said, I think there are going to be a lot of different ways where people are going to tweak the dials in coming years. People are going to say there has been too much of a crisis for developers, as James was so eloquently putting it. He let me shorten this part of the talk quite a bit. You know, the rules of open source were set down 20 years ago, but they are not infallible. They were not written on stone tablets, and we should stop treating them that way. So I'm really excited to see in the next 20 years how we experiment, how we push those boundaries, you know, both through the people in this room and through a lot of other people in the broader reach of open source. Thank you very much for your time. Bit.ly Tidelift_survey, or just come and find us and talk to us. Hopefully we've got a lot of awesome things to talk about with you. Thank you so much for your time, and oh, right. Because I'm a lawyer, here's some license information about the photos I used. Take it away, James, sir. Thank you.